This committee hearing will come to order. I'll ask all the members at this time if you could take your seats. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 6 bipartisan measures. As all members were notified previously, to expedite our consideration of these items today, we're going to take them up en bloc. The text previously provided to your offices, by the way, you have here, and all members, if you don't have those before you, please ask the staff. We'll make sure you do. The first is House Resolution 147, calling for the release of the United States citizen Saeed Abedini from Iran, and Smith Amendment number 40 in the nature of a substitute. Again, without objection, all of these items will be considered as read and will be considered en bloc. The next is House Resolution 402, supporting the European aspirations of EU Eastern Partnership countries, and Engel Amendment number 46 in the nature of a substitute. Next, House Resolution 404, expressing condolences and support for assistance to the victims of Typhoon Haiyan in the Republic of the Philippines, and Royce Amendment number 64 in that measure. Next is H.R. 1992, the Israel Qualitative Military Edge Enhancement Act, and Collins Amendment number 29 in the nature of a substitute. Then H.R. 3470, the Naval Vessel Transfer and Arms Export Control Amendments Act of 2013. And lastly, H.R. 3509, the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act, along with Royce Amendment number 63 and Salmon Amendment number 29 to that measure. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements for the record and extraneous materials on any of today's measures. And after recognizing myself and the ranking member for brief opening remarks, I'll be glad to recognize any committee members seeking recognition to speak on these measures. Now, first, I'd like to recognize myself in support for House Resolution 404. This is the bipartisan resolution I authored that expresses condolences to the victims of the super typhoon that hit the Philippines. And 12 days ago, what was one of the worst typhoons on record unleashed a torrent of destruction on the central Philippines, so complete that it is very difficult for us to comprehend. As of today, the death toll stands at over 4,000, with more than 4 million people displaced on the islands. Over 500,000 homes have been destroyed in the hardest hit areas. This bipartisan resolution expresses our condolences. The United States is committed to helping the Philippines. To date, the U.S. government has allocated over $37 million to this effort. The USS George Washington is stationed offshore and is conducting around-the-clock efforts to transport relief supplies and emergency workers to affected areas. In fact, more than 750,000 pounds of supplies have already been delivered. The municipal water pumping station in Tacloban is now operational again, thanks to the work of the U.S. Agency for International Development and thanks to the efforts of the Department of Defense. The resolution also recognizes the important role of the Filipino-American community in the relief effort. Many in the community were directly affected by the typhoon, with friends and family still unaccounted for. Indeed, the community has come together to raise funds and donated needed supplies. Some have even traveled to the Philippines to help there. Filipino Americans are rightly proud of their heritage, and they are committed to helping those affected by the typhoon recover and rebuild. The U.S. stands with the Philippines during this time of need. As the good people of the Philippines begin the difficult journey to recovery, the American people are here to lend our friendship and support. Second, we consider H.R. 3470, the Naval Vessel Transfer and Arms Export Control Amendments Act. This bill grants the Navy authority to transfer excess U.S. naval vessels to our East Asian partners, to Taiwan and Thailand, as well as to neighboring Mexico. By doing so, we help the Navy manage its inventory of decommissioned ships while strengthening the ties with U.S. security partners. Because the Navy will no longer have to store these vessels, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that this bill will save taxpayers $40 million. In addition, the recipient countries will pay for the refurbishment and upkeep of those transferred frigates, which is expected to result in a $50 million economic benefit for American workers per frigate who will do the work. This bill also helps expedite routine U.S. arms sales to NATO and other defense partners while maintaining appropriate congressional oversight. Third, we also take up Mr. Collins' bill. This is 1992, the Israel Qualitative Military Edge Enhancement Act. And I want to recognize Mr. Collins for his leadership on this important piece of legislation, a testament to the American people's enduring commitment to Israel's security. In 2008, Congress required the President to assess, on an ongoing basis, the extent to which Israel possesses a qualitative military edge over threats against it, which, as we know, are all too real. Currently, this assessment is done every 4 years and focuses on conventional military threats. This bill would require the Congress receive this assessment on a more timely basis every 2 years and would require the Administration to specify in a separate one-time report how it is integrating cyber and asymmetric threats to Israel into its overall security assistance framework. Next, we have H.R. 3509, the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act, which is a bipartisan product of thorough committee work. Last summer, the committee received a GAO report detailing the startling lack of progress on U.S.-funded post-earthquake reconstruction efforts on the island. The committee followed up by sending a bipartisan delegation of staff to investigate and then held a hearing on Haiti reconstruction where members asked tough questions about U.S. aid efforts. One recommendation we heard over and over was that Congress needs better and more frequent reporting to ensure that we are being kept up to date on reconstruction activities and so that Congress can provide tough oversight at a time when much of the funding for Haiti is yet to be spent. And this bill does just that. So I commend Representatives Barbara Lee, Ranking Member Engel, Chairman Ross Leitonen, Chairman Salmon for their focus on Haiti and for working in a bipartisan fashion to craft strong oversight legislation. Next, I'd like to thank Ranking Member Engel for his work on House Resolution 402 to support the European aspirations of the Eastern Partnership countries. The EU's upcoming Eastern Partnership Summit, which will take place in Lithuania, represents an important step in the development of the 3 Eastern Partnership countries of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. The association agreement these countries plan to sign will deepen our diplomatic and economic ties with the EU, representing not only a significant upgrade in their engagement with the West, but also a valuable opportunity for job creation, for economic growth as well. These agreements will encourage the countries to continue their democratic reform efforts, a foreign policy interest shared by the United States. And lastly, I want to voice my support for House Resolution 147, which presses for the release and safe return of Pastor Saeed Abedini to his wife and young children. While the administration negotiations are ongoing as we try to negotiate with Iran in what a number of us are concerned might be a bad nuclear deal in Geneva this week, Iran continues to suppress minorities and persecute U.S. citizens. The case of this pastor is a particularly egregious example. This Iranian-born American is wasting away in Iran's prison system and is said to be suffering from beatings. We take it seriously because of the hundreds of executions that have been carried out over the last 100 and so days in Iran. And this critical resolution presses for his release and calls on the administration to impose sanctions on those responsible for his imprisonment. and for the regime's broader suppression of religious minorities. Many of you know the fate of the Baha'i there, the fate of the Christian community, the fate of some of the Jewish community, and so forth, and other minority sects in Iran. I will now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Engel, for his remarks.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this markup and for advancing these important pieces of legislation. I concur with your remarks, and I again commend you for the bipartisan way that we are conducting this committee. Firstly, I strongly support HRES 147, which calls on Iran to release Saeed Abedini, an American citizen and Christian pastor. Mr. Abedini has been imprisoned in Iran since September 2012 because the paranoid regime in Tehran believes that his Christian faith poses a threat to national security. He has been abused and tortured by Iranian authorities and denied medical care, and I hope the State Department and our friends in the international community will continue to raise this case directly and publicly with Iran as we all work to return him home safely. Next, I strongly support HRES 402, a resolution I authored that supports the European aspiration of states in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region that belong to the European Union's Eastern Partnership Program. Specifically, we support the right of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia to exercise their sovereign rights to deepen their economic and political ties with the European Union. Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia may conclude agreements with the EU at the end of the month, this month, which will strengthen democratic institutions, spur economic growth, and bolster the rule of law. That's the three countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. As such, they will benefit the region and pose no threat to any other state. We urge all nations to respect the right of these states to enter into beneficial partnerships of their choosing. We urge all nations, especially Russia. At the same time, we urge Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia to continue their laudable reform efforts, to continue to adopt democratic norms and standards, and to meet remaining essential conditions for closer relations with the European Union. Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to have introduced with you HRES 404, a resolution expressing deep sympathy and support to the Philippines following Typhoon Haiyan. You and I both visited the Philippines together in January, and we know that the people there are suffering and really rely on the United States for help. This resolution expresses the commitment of the United States to provide assistance to help the people of the Philippines recover from this disaster and support for relief and reconstruction assistance provided by the international community. The typhoon that struck earlier this month caused massive destruction and killed thousands of people, and our thoughts and prayers go out to the survivors and to the families who lost loved ones because of the storm. The Philippines is a close friend and treaty ally of the United States, and we will continue our efforts to assist the government and the people of the Philippines in their recovery. When we were in the Philippines, Mr. Chairman, we had an excellent meeting with President Aquino of the Philippines, who is, of course, struggling to make his people whole again. I also support H.R. 1992, the Israel Qualitative Military Edge Enhancement Act. Thank Mr. Collins, Mr. Schneider, for their role in crafting this critical piece of legislation. Helping Israel to maintain its qualitative military edge is critical to ensure that our closest ally in the region has the resources necessary to protect itself from countries such as Iran and others committed to its destruction. Specifically, this bill improves upon legislation previously passed by this committee by strengthening reporting requirements which will give Congress greater oversight over QME efforts. In addition, the legislation clarifies that cyber threats must be included in our quantitative military edge assessment efforts. Again, I would like to thank Congressman Schneider, Congressman Collins for their work on this bill and strongly urge my colleagues to support it. I also support H.R. 3470, another bipartisan bill that exercises and therefore preserves the committee's jurisdiction in two areas: naval ship transfers and controls on military exports. The bill authorizes the transfer of 6 surplus U.S. Navy warships to 3 countries, 2 by grant to Mexico and Thailand, and 4 by sale to Taiwan. The bill also amends the Arms Export Control Act to update the dollar thresholds for congressional review of and propose military transfers to other governments. In addition, the bill amends the ECA to preserve congressional oversight over military transfers that will be made under the administration's Export Control Reform Initiative. And finally, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3509, the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act of 2013. This legislation should be understood as another step in the ongoing work of this committee to exercise oversight over U.S. assistance provided to Haiti in the aftermath of the devastating January 2010 earthquake. We commissioned a GAO report on that assistance, which found, among other things, that the administration was not providing sufficient information to the Congress to fulfill its oversight role. We also sent a bipartisan staff delegation to look into the problems GAO found and held a full committee hearing on that matter. H.R. 3509 seeks to fill the information gap by requiring the State Department to report on various aspects of our assistance program. It also includes a statement of policy that articulates the direction we think that assistance program should take. I would like to thank Barbara Lee, the original author of the bill, for her vision and tenacity in keeping the Haiti issue in front of us, as well as Chairman Royce for his work on this bill. And this comes piggybacked onto a very important PEPFAR bill we passed yesterday on the floor of the House, which will benefit Africa and benefit Haiti as well. Once again, I'd like to thank Chairman Royce for holding this markup and for working in a bipartisan way on all of the measures before us today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel, and thank you for your important contributions to today's legislation. We're going to go now to any members seeking recognition to speak on the en bloc items. And Eliana Ross-Leitonen from Florida, Chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to support all of these bipartisan measures and briefly speak on a few. Last week, our subcommittee unanimously passed House Resolution 147 calling on the release of the U.S. citizen Saeed Abedini and condemning Iran for its persecution of religious minorities. Pastor Saeed Abedini has been sentenced to 8 years in prison simply for being a Christian and practicing his faith in Iran. Earlier this month, Saeed was transferred to a notorious prison reserved for Iran's most violent criminals. His life is in danger on a daily basis, and he is being denied the critical medical care that he needs. Passing this resolution will send a strong signal of support to Saeed and his family, that we have not forgotten him, and that we will continue to fight for his safe and immediate return, and will also send a message to the regime in Tehran that its violations of human rights will not be ignored and it will be held to account. As the negotiations continue with Iran over its nuclear program, it's important to highlight just what kind of regime the administration is prepared to ease sanctions on in return for empty promises. Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism, is a gross violator of human rights that systematically violates and persecutes religious minorities and cracks down on civil rights. I also support H.R. 1992, the Israel QME Enhancement Act, authored by our colleague Mr. Collins. It's essential that Congress send a strong signal to Israel and to the world that we remain committed to our relationship with our friend and strategic ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel. With Iran still on the path to develop nuclear weapons and the administration putting more pressure on Congress to hold off on increasing sanctions on Iran rather than verifying that Iran will halt all of its nuclear activity, Israel has every reason to be concerned over her safety. That is why it is crucial that Israel remain not just one step ahead of her enemies in the region, but light years ahead. There is no room for error here. Israel must maintain its qualitative military edge over its foes because her very survival depends on it. I would also like to commend Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for bringing forward House Resolution 404 to express condolences and support for assistance to the victims of the typhoon in the Philippines. I joined a bipartisan congressional letter earlier this week asking the Department of Homeland Security to offer TPS, temporary protected status, to nationals of the Philippines. And as we continue to assist and provide assistance to the people of the Philippines, we must also learn from our mistakes from the past when it comes to providing assistance after natural disasters. Our reconstruction efforts after the Haiti earthquake from 2010 are still ongoing, and it is our responsibility to advocate for greater transparency and accountability on the use of U.S. taxpayer dollars. So I joined our colleagues Barbara Lee, Chairman Royce, and Ranking Member Engel in introducing H.R. 3509, the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act. This important bill calls on the Department of State to submit a report on the status of post-earthquake recovery and development efforts in Haiti. The report will help ensure that our assistance dollars to the Haitian people are going to those who really need it and not to waste, fraud, and abuse. Elections in Haiti have been delayed for 2 years, over 2 years, and that is simply unacceptable. This bill reaffirms our commitment to the fundamental principles of holding free, fair, and transparent elections in accordance with the Haitian Constitution. Passing this legislation, therefore, Mr. Chairman, will send a clear message that we want elections to be scheduled very soon without any more delays in order to improve the volatile political environment in Haiti and help the lives of the Haitian people. Our South Florida community is blessed to have a vibrant Haitian American community, and the diaspora keenly follows the developments in Haiti. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
Thank you. We're going to go to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island. Recognized now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Engel for your leadership and for the bipartisan manner in which we are marking up these bills. I appreciate the smooth and deliberate way in which the package of legislation is being handled and proudly support all the legislation contained in this en bloc package. In particular, I'd like to thank the committee for moving forward on House Resolution 404 regarding the devastation left in the Philippines in the wake of this devastating typhoon. I've expressed my condolences and the sympathy of the 1st District of Rhode Island and will continue to do so as the death toll rises and damage reports increase. I want to reiterate that the resolution expresses solidarity with the people of the Philippines and affirms our commitment to provide essential assistance. Similarly, I've made resources available to my constituents who would like to help those suffering the loss of life and destruction of property in the Philippines. In addition, as we consider HRES 402 supporting the European aspirations of the people of the European Union's Eastern Partnership, I want to stress the importance of the adoption of democratic social norms by these countries along with their economic integration. Over the past several years, we've seen some impressive improvements in the human rights of individuals in Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia. While the situation isn't perfect, the trend is generally positive and deserves our ongoing support. I was pleased that the Moldovan government took actions last year to reverse some locally passed laws which restricted the rights of all Moldovans who support the human rights of LGBT persons. These local ordinances were passed most often under pressure from the local Communist Party or the Eastern Orthodox Church, which has close contact with the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. The human rights of LGBT individuals were further strengthened in Moldova as part of the Eastern Partnership effort. In order to ease travel restrictions and simplify tourist visas for Moldovan citizens to EU countries, the Moldovan Parliament was asked and agreed to pass legislation ensuring that individuals cannot be fired from a job on the basis of his or her sexual orientation or gender identity. Indeed, I look forward to the day when similar legislation will pass here in the United States and in the House of Representatives, as it did earlier this month in the Senate with broad bipartisan support. Improving relations with the European Union does not and should not harm the important relationships these countries have with their largest neighbor, Russia. Unfortunately, Russia has increased threats against Eastern Partnership countries, unnecessarily threatening important trade and energy ties. Nevertheless, I'm pleased to see several countries take steps to better protect and support religious minorities, LGBT individuals, and other marginalized communities. I'm thankful for the Eastern Partnership's countries that have overcome Russia's efforts to dissuade them from social progress. In Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, the governments and people are quickly realizing that protecting the rights of the minority ensures the fundamental freedoms enjoyed by the majority. Certainly, sexual orientation and gender identity remain controversial issues in Eastern Europe, as is the case in some parts of our own country. But we all know that the right to organize, to march, to display proud is healthy for us as a country. These countries deserve our support and that of the EU. I commend the Chairman and the Ranking Member for moving this important piece of legislation and look forward to its passage. And finally, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1992 that will increase the frequency of review of Israel's qualitative military edge and adds a requirement that such reviews include cyber and asymmetric threats. This legislation will enhance our national security interests as we better understand Israel's military capability and ensure that they have the necessary resources for their defense, as our most important ally in a very volatile region of the world. I thank you, Madam Chairman, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Chairman Smith of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me just say to my colleagues, H.Res. 147, introduced by our distinguished colleague, Dr. Cassidy, is an excellent resolution, but it was introduced in April, and what we're doing in the amendment in nature of a substitute is expanding from 6 to 18 the whereas clauses and adding one line trying to hold Iran to account for its it is a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So international agreements are important, and when they sign something, they should be willing to live up to it. Last March, Chairman Frank Wolf chaired a hearing that was called The Worsening Plight of Religious Minorities in Iran. His key witness was Naghmeh Abedini, the wife of Saeed Abedini. And I'd just like to quote, it's long, and I would ask unanimous consent that her full statement be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
But just a couple of lines pulled from that testimony, which just underscores the awful plight of this great pastor who went back to Iran, he's an American, to establish an orphanage. He was given an assurance by the government of Iran that he would not be in any way interfered with. It certainly wouldn't be arrested. He was accused in the past of proselytizing his Christian faith, and for that he had been beaten, and he is now serving an 8-year sentence. He has been subjected to repeated beatings. He is now in a prison where we are all very fearful for his life. He has several people in his very cell who are convicted murderers. And one of the modus operandi of anybody who's ever worked on human rights know is that both the communists and many of these dictatorial regimes often put political and religious prisoners, democracy activists, into a prison cell that has people in it who have committed heinous crimes, and as a quid pro quo, take care of our problem and you will get a lighter sentence. It happens over and over again, so we're bringing additional attention to that very serious deterioration of Pastor Abedini's case. Here's what Naghmeh said. We have 2 kids, Rebecca Grace, who is 6 years old, and Jacob Cyrus, who is 4 years old. A day does not go by that they do not ask for their daddy. A day does not go by that they do not long for him. Most nights, they cry themselves to sleep, waiting for their daddy to come home. She goes on to say, it's unfortunate that Christians are the #1 persecuted people in the world, but not much attention and effort is being taken to protect their religious liberty. She points out how we went back to establish the orphanage, and all of that is in her statement, and I summarized it very briefly. She has said Saeed has endured beatings, internal bleeding, death threats, and continued psychological torture, all because he will not deny his Christian faith. Naghmeh said, and this was very unfortunate, I must tell you, she quotes, that I am disappointed in my government. I am disappointed that our President and our State Department have not fully engaged this issue. Disappointed that this great country is not doing more to free my husband, a U.S. citizen. She goes on, yes, we are both proud to be American citizens, and I expect more from our government. As a direct result of that hearing and her testimony, I'm happy to report that Secretary of State Kerry did make an intervention, as did the State Department, but this needs to be ongoing, consistent, and persistent, and certainly sustained in order to effectuate his release. I do hope members will support the resolution. They already have, because we're now on the debate portion. But this man needs to be freed, and his plight needs to be echoed throughout parliaments throughout the world, in Europe and elsewhere, on his behalf. And secondly, Madam Chair, I'd just like to say I strongly endorse the resolution expressing our empathy and sympathy for all those who have suffered from the typhoon. Yes, there have been approximately 4,000 deaths, 10,000 people who have been malaffected by this horrific storm. The United Nations has suggested made a call for 301 million. The United States has come forward with 37 million. The Catholic Relief Services alone, one NGO, and they just had a massive collection in every Catholic church throughout the country to raise this money, has pledged $20 million. I would respectfully submit $37 million needs to be looked at as a down payment. The needs are overwhelming, and my hope is that we will be more generous. The same thing happened during the tsunami in 2004, and I traveled to Bandi, Aceh, Phuket, and Sri Lanka, And many of us who came back were very concerned that our paltry commitment in 2004 in no way came near to what was needed. I see a deja vu occurring here, Madam Chair. We need to do more. There are assessment teams on the ground. My hope is that Congress will robustly support the Filipino people. Two major problems, and I'll be very brief in this. Very concerned about the trafficking situation there, and we've asked a number of questions about what is being done to mitigate any trafficking under the chaos of the storm. And secondly, very often, and this happened in Haiti, the higher death count is attributed to typhoid and cholera and other diseases that manifest after the fact. I'm not convinced we're doing enough to ensure that people are properly protected from the epidemics that could ensue in the days and weeks that follow. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel for the bipartisan leadership they've shown, continue to show on this committee, and the committee itself for its example of collaboration that should be a lesson for us all. I'm pleased to support all of these bipartisan measures. I join with my colleagues in extending condolences to the people of the Philippines in the aftermath of the typhoon. Specifically, I wish to speak on the H.R. 1992, the Israel Qualitative Military Edge Enhancement Act. I am most grateful for the collaboration of my friend, Mr. Collins. I want to thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member for working diligently with my office and Representative Collins to bring this important legislation before the committee. Israel stands at a historic juncture. It is in an increasingly dangerous neighborhood at an increasingly dangerous time. Israel must have the capabilities to deal with a broad spectrum of potential threats. That is why we introduced this important and timely bill to help further safeguard the technological edge Israel has and must always have in defending the country and safeguarding her citizens. This bill expands upon existing requirements that the United States aid Israel in developing defense systems capable of safeguarding our most important regional ally, Israel, against both conventional and asymmetrical threats. Significant examples of this cooperation include the highly successful, game-changing Iron Dome anti-missile system, as well as the ongoing development of the Arrow and David Sling. Israel now faces dramatically evolving threats of regional insecurity, including a virtual failed state on its border with Syria, tens of thousands of rockets and mortars being stockpiled by Hezbollah on the north, continued rocket fire from Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and increasing terrorist activity in the Sinai. But most importantly, the existential threat of Iran and its nuclear program. The U.S. can and will continue to do more to aid Israel in addressing all of these threats in a comprehensive way. The bill before us today would specifically encourage greater coordination between Israel and the United States in developing new weapons, tactics, and procedures to confront the growing threats of cyber warfare, asymmetrical military threat, and ongoing terrorist activity. Increased reporting and coordination will allow the United States and Israel to continue their mutually beneficial research and intelligence programs to save lives and create a more secure and prosperous region. I want to again thank the Chair and Ranking Member for their support of this legislation. I also want to thank Mr. Collins for the hard work we have done to hone this bill over the last few months. I ask that my colleagues join me in support of this bill and the others today, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Marino of Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I want to address House Resolution 402, supporting the EU's Eastern Partnership countries. The bill would express Congress's support for the expansion of the EU to include Georgia, Moldova, and the Ukraine. Russia does not like this possibility. Russia wants to continue to control the former Soviet states, and Russia sees the European Union expansion as a threat to Russia's power in the region. Russia is doing all it can to stop these former Soviet states from siding with Western countries, in part by cutting off natural gas to these countries or spiking the cost of natural gas, and by pushing these countries to enter trade compacts with Russia if they promise not to enter into similar agreements with the EU. I support the efforts of Georgia, Moldova, and the Ukraine to enter into agreements with the European Union. I also hope the administration expresses similar support and takes the steps necessary to ensure it a smooth, easy transition. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I, of course, support all of the bills on our agenda. I particularly highlight the Haiti legislation This is a country devastated by an earthquake, and its recovery has been slow and painful and uneven at best. There are issues about coordination among NGOs. There are issues about, frankly, the distribution of our own bilateral assistance. There are issues about the multilateral response to this tragedy. This is a country that is not far away. It is in our backyard. And if we can't get coordinated assistance in the event, when we've had this kind of tragic development right in our own backyard, I think it calls into question the efficacy of our ability to deliver aid effectively anywhere. And so I think it is really important we focus on Haiti. I'm delighted to see this legislation on the agenda, and I would hope that the committee will continue to monitor this very carefully as we move forward. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Collins of Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the willingness of the Chairman and you as well, and your willingness to work with me on this important bipartisan bill. I want to thank the committee, and really this committee is one of the few places I believe left in Congress where we do have bipartisanship as the norm and not the exception, and that is always a good thing to see. I'd also like to thank my friend from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, and his staff for their work on this legislation. It is amazing when we work together, and what your staff has done and the others who have come across on this bill has been really good to see, along with the chairman and the ranking member who have been so good friends with this as well. So I want to thank you for all your hard work. Excuse me, the U.S. has stood with Israel from its inception 65 years ago, and our countries remain close allies for a good reason. America and Israel share many of the same goals. Both countries have strong expressed desire to protect their citizens from harm, to promote the principles of democracy, and to promote a stable and prosperous Middle East. The benefits of the Israeli-American relationship are undeniable. Our alliance has been vital for each nation's intelligence gathering efforts, resulting in many lives saved. I introduced H.R. 1992 because I believe that America's support for Israel must be responsive to the changing threats facing our ally. This week, the United States and other member nations are meeting to discuss Iran's nuclear program. Iran's ambitions are no secret, and they currently possess the proper quantity and type of materials to make nuclear weapons. But Iran's nuclear program is not the only threat to Israel. I am very concerned by the cyber threats attacks that have been launched against the country. Nations in the regions are increasingly using cyber warfare as a means to cripple infrastructure and violently disrupt the security of this peace-loving nation. H.R. 1992 directs the President to report to Congress every 2 years. Current law requires a report every 4 years regarding the assessment of Israel's qualitative military edge over military threats to Israel and related weapons sales in the Middle East. Additionally, it directs the Secretary of State to report on cyber and asymmetric threats in reference to Israel. I believe this legislation represents an effective way to promote U.S.-Israeli relationships in a bipartisan manner. Given recent developments in the region, there is no better time to ensure that Congress has the most complete and up-to-date information regarding Israel's qualitative military edge. The very real threats of cyber attacks and asymmetrical warfare in Israel must be taken into account as our nation's continued fight against terrorism in the 21st century. This legislation ensures that a United States commitment to Israel's qualitative military edge remains substantial and meaningful. It provides Congress the ability to continue its oversight of weapons sales to the Middle East at an increased regularity by reviewing arms sales from 4 to 2 years. I am very appreciative of the Chairman for allowing this piece of legislation to come before the committee. Ranking Member Engel, for your support, brings increased probity to the bill. And Mr. Schneider, you have been, again, such a great partner on this relationship. You are such a dedicated advocate for U.S.-Israeli relationships. It stands in a light to many here. And also, Ms. Gabbard, I also appreciate your early support of this legislation as well. And I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lowenthal of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I join with my colleagues in thanking Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for conducting all the hearings on the Foreign Affairs Committee in such a bipartisan way. It really is a pleasure to come to these committees. And I also want to voice my support for all the bills. But I would really like to talk about one aspect of H.R. 3470, which is the Naval Vessel Transfer and Arms Export Control Amendments, that specific part of the H.R. 3470. I want to thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for your staff for your working on the bill on this. The Title II of H.R. 3470 contains important improvements in the licensing of U.S. exports under the Arms Exports Control Act. These improvements that are included in this bill will streamline our congressional review of pending licenses by focusing our committee's oversight on major defense transfers. This is accomplished by updating the dollar thresholds under the Arms Export Control Act for export cases that are subject to congressional scrutiny. This is the first updating in many years. When enacted, this will focus congressional attention on the truly important defense exports. Many of the U.S. companies that export defense articles are located in Southern California, especially in and near my congressional district. The California aerospace industry will definitely benefit from this bill. In addition, the Port of Long Beach, which I represent, will also definitely benefit by a more efficient export licensing procedure, speeding approvals and contributing to the U.S. firms winning more export sales. While streamlining defense export licensing, this bill also adjusts the congressional review process to better fit with the reforms that the Obama administration is now beginning to implement under its Export Control Reform Initiative. In sum, this bill makes improvements for American defense exporters and focuses congressional oversight on the significant transfers that warrant close scrutiny. Madam Chair, I yield back my time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Meadows of North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Collins from Georgia and Mr. Schneider, for working so diligently on H.R. 1992. Early on, they worked with committee here who've just done an outstanding job in making sure not only this legislation is ready to be brought to the floor, but that it addresses the key concerns in terms of our allies. And so I just want to thank the gentleman, and obviously it has my support. I want to speak briefly, though, on Pastor Saeed Abedini. It is very troubling that here we are in the middle of negotiations with Iran. And a pastor is being held, quite frankly, in a very dangerous situation. A gesture of goodwill by that country that would transcend not only just one state to another, but much of our nation, and show that indeed that our two countries are ready for some type of bilateral talks on a foundation of mutual respect. You would think that releasing Pastor Saeed Abedini would be an easy lift. And yet here we are having to pass a resolution condemning that action. And Madam Chair, you have been a strong voice for those that are held in foreign countries against the international norms that are there. I applaud you on your unrelenting voice. I join you and urge the Iranian people to look at this injustice and let Pastor Saeed Abedini go. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Keating of Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to voice my support for all the initiatives on today's markup, but I would like to thank, in particular, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for working with me on House Resolution 402. As an original co-sponsor and as Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats, I believe it's important for the United States to show its support for the European aspirations of the 6 Eastern Partnership countries. Next week in Vilnius at the summit, 3 of these countries are poised to take truly historic steps forward. 25 years ago, no one could have imagined that Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, then Soviet republics, would be on the verge of signing or initialing association agreements with the European Union. Their laudable progress demonstrates each country's resilience and the strength of their citizens' desire for a transparent governance and a rule of law. In addition to the association agreements, which include a key free trade component, the EU recently launched the Eastern Partnership Transport Network to improve the roads, rails, and ports of the Eastern Partnership countries and to link them with the EU's own transportation system. I strongly believe the United States should support the Eastern Partnership Transport Network by working closely with the EU, international donors, and hosts of countries to improve their infrastructure and regulatory mechanisms to facilitate more trade with the EU between Europe and Asia. This will also support the broader New Silk Road vision that is coming to connect Central and South Asia to larger markets and help transform the Northern Distribution Network, also known as the NDN, into a viable commercial corridor. Although these agreements and initiatives pose no threat to other countries, Russia has sought to undermine Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and threatened to retaliate further if they move forward with association agreements with the EU. Madam Chairman, it's important for the United States to support Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine at this historic moment. It's equally important that we make clear that Russia's behavior in this regard is unacceptable. With that, I yield back.
We thank the gentleman for yielding back. I think we have two remaining speakers. Our Western Hemisphere Chairman Matt Salmon from Arizona, followed by Mr. Deutsch from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to commend you and the entire committee for all of this bipartisan legislation today, which is, I believe, it's been said before that this is probably one of the last committees in all of Congress that does things in such a bipartisan way, and I think it's wonderful. It's a good example to set for the other committees as well. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for working with me and accepting my amendments, strengthening some of the reporting requirements for the H.R. 3509. The Haitian funding bill is incredibly important, but it's important also that we make sure that our taxpayers are actually getting what they expected and what they're paying for when it comes to getting money to a very, very badly needed place in the globe and in the hemisphere. This language that Mark Walker was able to strengthen and put together, I believe, makes it clear that the U.S. aid and taxpayer funds must be spent wisely and in accordance with the policies that are outlined in this bill. In addition, I appreciated the opportunity to work with committee staff on the other side of the aisle as well. I know that Mark was able to lead a staff delegation over there not so long ago and found while there are still some troubling things, there are some very positive things. And we want to focus on both of those things. When the 2010 earthquake struck our neighbors in Haiti, the U.S. was swift with our response and promised to be a major part in the long-term recovery process. Our citizens have been generous in both the $3.6 billion in taxpayer funds dedicated to the recovery, but also billions in private funds have flowed to assist Haitian recovery to help them rebuild. But it's our obligation here in Congress to make sure that these funds are spent efficiently, effectively, and transparently. After the GAO's critical report, this bill will help to address the lack of transparency and accountability that our aid to Haiti has suffered to date. As we learned from our hearing in our subcommittee last month, Haiti has a long way to go in their recovery, and it's important that the Haitian government work diligently to improve the investment climate in their country and move toward free and fair elections and make sure that the democratic process moves forward. I've been very, very disappointed in reports from the government that harassing U.S. companies who are trying to do business in the country, and sadly reports like that are going to have a long-term impact on investment in Haiti. I believe that if they want to go forward in a very, very positive way, they've got to improve the rule of law there, make sure that they don't shake down foreign business interests. And finally, as incorporated in this bill, I strongly urge the government of Haiti to move forward with those elections as soon as possible. People of Haiti deserve a voice in their government, and I think it's just plain fair and common sense. But thank you, and I yield back the balance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Salmon. I want to thank you for your excellent contribution to the focus on Haiti and also for promoting trade and investment in this hemisphere, and we appreciate that very much. We're going to turn now to recognize Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to lend my support to these good bills. I'd like to thank Congressman Collins and Congressman Schneider for introducing the Israel QME Enhancement Act. This bipartisan legislation emphasizes Congress's commitment to ensuring Israel's qualitative military edge, an essential component of Israel's security. We talk a lot about the importance of bipartisanship in Congress when it comes to Israel's security, and it is thanks to members like Mr. Schneider and Mr. Collins that we can work across the aisle to further this kind of critical cooperation, and I applaud their efforts. The United States has committed to ensuring Israel's right and ability to defend herself against any threat, period. But in its volatile neighborhood, Israel can face threats at each of her borders at any moment, from the risk of spillover from the Syrian conflict, rockets from Hamas and Hezbollah, and the ever-present existential threat of potentially nuclear-armed Iran. This legislation will provide Congress with greater oversight when it comes to Israel's qualitative military edge. By increasing the reporting requirements on QME from every 4 years to every 2 years, we can continue to ensure that our great ally Israel has the capabilities to counter any and all threats. In addition, it is the strategic cooperation with Israel that ensures greater interoperability with our own military to defend our security interests in the region. I also want to express my support for HRES 147, which condemns the government of Iran for its persecution of religious minorities, including Saeed Abedini. The recent reports that Pastor Abedini was recently moved to a more dangerous facility outside of Tehran further demonstrates that the U.S. must do everything in our power to end his continued and unjust imprisonment. However, this markup also provides an opportunity to highlight what is not being talked about in Geneva, Iran's egregious human rights violations. While preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons capabilities is our paramount objective, it should not impact our support for human rights in Iran. Iran's vile mistreatment of its people is not new, but since taking office, President Rouhani has spoken about the need to repair Iran's relationships with the world and ensure the rights of his people. Unfortunately, his rhetoric has not been matched with action. Hundreds of political prisoners remain in prison. This year alone, more than 500 Iranians have been executed, double Ahmadinejad's last year in office. In the past month, there has been a stunning wave of repression targeting the media and civil society that included the banning of a prominent reformist daily and the arrest of a prominent and politically minded actress. Iran is also suspected of having significant knowledge as to the whereabouts of my constituent, Robert Levinson. As many of you know, in March of 2007, Robert Levinson was taken hostage while visiting Iran's Kish Island. A retired FBI agent, husband, father to 7 children, and grandfather of 2, Mr. Levinson has missed 6 years' worth of birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, and other important milestones. Next Tuesday, Robert Levinson will have been held captive for 2,455 days, making him the longest-held American hostage in our nation's history. As Iran continues to flagrantly violate basic human rights, we must continue to press Iran to treat their people with due process and with fairness, and we must act to ensure the release of all political prisoners, including Pastor Abedini, Amir Hekmati, and we must do everything we can to bring Robert Levinson home to his family. This markup is an important step. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank you, the Ranking Member, and Congresswoman Lee for introducing H.R. 3509, the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act of 2013. We are privileged to have a strong Haitian diaspora in South Florida, and I know how much they appreciate Congress's commitment to reconstruction and stabilization efforts in Haiti. We must continue to provide strong oversight to ensure that our aid dollars are helping Haiti rebuild critical infrastructure, promote good governance and rule of law, and provide much-needed access to health care and to education. Again, I thank all of the bill sponsors, and I look forward to the final passage of this good legislation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question now occurs on agreeing to the items being considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the items are considered en bloc and agreed to, and without objection. The measures agreed to in bloc: House Resolution 147 is amended, 402 is amended, 404 is amended, 1992 is amended, 3470, and 3509 as amended, these measures are considered, favorably reported to the House. Staff are directed to make technical and conforming changes. And just in closing, I want to thank our ranking member, Mr. Engel, and all of the committee members for their contributions, for their assistance in today's markup. The committee stands adjourned.